You pull up to your favorite shallow cove on a beautiful spring morning. The water is warming up, the calendar says it is time, and every old-timer at the local bait shop swore the crappie are stacked on the banks. But 2 hours later, your bucket is completely empty. Why? What if I told you that the very thing making you think they are shallow is exactly what is driving them back to the deep? Today, we are talking about the biggest lie in spring crappie fishing. I am going to show you the one overlooked factor that pushes those big slabs right out of the shallows, leaving you casting at absolute ghosts. Drop a comment right now and tell me, how many days have you wasted beating the banks when the fish just were not there? Let us set the stage here. For decades, the golden rule of spring fishing has been incredibly simple. When the dogwoods bloom and the water hits 60 degrees, you head straight to the shallows. You tie on a jig or hook a minnow, cast into 2 feet of water near some brush, and haul them in. It is a tradition. Guys do the exact same thing year after year, fishing the exact same stumps. We are conditioned to believe that once crappie move up to spawn, they stay locked onto that bank until the job is completely done. But nature doesn't care about our rules or Grandpa's old fishing journal. The truth is that transition from deep winter holes to shallow spawning beds is not a straight line. It is a roller coaster. And if you do not understand the brakes on that roller coaster, you are going to get left behind. Let us picture a very familiar scenario. You wake up at 4 in the morning, pour your coffee, and hitch up the boat. The air feels mild, and the calendar says it is mid-April. You just know in your gut that the spring crappie are sitting in 2 feet of water, aggressively guarding their beds. You pull up to that shallow flat, the sun is just starting to peek over the tree line, and the lake is as flat as a sheet of glass. You tie on a tiny marabou jig, make that first perfect cast right next to a submerged laydown, and you wait for that unmistakable thump. But nothing happens. You cast again and again. You switch colors. You try a minnow under a bobber, but the water seems completely dead. You start thinking maybe you lost your touch, or maybe the fish have not moved in yet. But the reality is much more frustrating. Those fish were there yesterday afternoon. They were stacked up and feeding heavily. But something happened over the last 12 hours that pushed every single one of those slab crappie right back out to the deep water, and you are completely unaware of it. This brings us to the biggest myth in all of spring crappie fishing. We have been taught by generations of old-school anglers that the spring migration is a one-way street. The prevailing belief is that once the water temperature hits 55 or 60 degrees, the fish leave their deep wintering holes, swim up to the shallow banks, build their nests, and stay there until the spawn is entirely finished. We treat it like a permanent change of address, but that is simply not how the biology of these fish works. Crappie are incredibly sensitive creatures, and their movement toward the shallows is actually a series of starts and stops. It is a back-and-forth dance that can last for several weeks. They might push into 2 feet of water on a Tuesday afternoon when the sun is beating down and warming the surface. But by Wednesday morning, they could be sitting out in 15 feet of water, sulking near a brush pile. If you are fishing under the assumption that they never retreat, you're going to spend a lot of days casting into empty water and going home with a dry live well. So, what is the number one thing that drives these fish away from the banks? It is the dreaded spring cold front. We all know that spring weather is incredibly volatile. You can be wearing a short sleeve shirt on Monday and a heavy winter coat on Wednesday. When a cold front rolls through, it brings a sudden drop in air temperature, but more importantly, it causes a rapid shift in the barometric pressure. Even a slight dip in the surface water temperature can send a biological shockwave through a school of shallow crappie. Those fish do not just hunker down in the shallow brush and wait it out. Their instinct tells them that shallow water is suddenly a dangerous and unstable environment. To find stability, They instinctively pull back to the nearest deep water drop-off. They use the underwater creek channels like highways, retreating to 10 or 20 feet of water where the temperature is much more consistent and the pressure changes are less severe. You're up there freezing in the shallow wind, casting at stumps, while the fish have already evacuated the entire area. Even without a massive headline-making storm system, the simple day-to-night temperature fluctuations during the early spring can completely ruin your shallow water bite. Imagine a beautiful sunny afternoon where the shallow coves warm up nicely. The crappie push up into the very back of the creeks to feed on small bait fish and scout for nesting sites. But then the sun goes down, and the clear night sky allows all that radiant heat to escape. The air temperature drops down into the upper 30s or low 40s. By the time you launch your boat at dawn, that shallow water has cooled off by 5 or 6 degrees. To a human, that might not seem like a big deal, but to a cold-blooded crappie, a sudden 5-degree drop in shallow water is incredibly uncomfortable. It temporarily shuts down their metabolism. Because shallow water cools down just as fast as it warms up, the fish slip back out into the deeper adjacent channels overnight to find a more stable thermal layer. That is why your early morning shallow bite is completely non-existent, despite what the calendar says. Let us visualize what this stalled migration actually looks like beneath the surface. Picture a massive school of slab crappie moving out of a deep river channel. They follow a secondary point, moving up into a large, stump-filled bay. They are staging in about 8 feet of water, waiting for the perfect moment. A warm afternoon arrives, and they slide up into 3 feet of water to mingle in the submerged willows. Everything is going perfectly, according to the spring plan. But then the wind shifts to the north. The sky turns a pale, high-pressure blue. In an instant, the invisible signal is sent. You will not see a massive splashing panic. Instead, it is a slow, methodical retreat. Like an army pulling back from the front lines, they simply turn around and follow the exact same path they used to come in. They drop down off the shallow flat, slide over the lip of the creek channel, and sink down into the dark timber at 15 feet. By the time you arrive with your ultralight rod, the shallow bay is completely deserted. It is a ghost town, and you are left casting into the absolute void. We really need to talk about the physical effect of barometric pressure on these fish. It is not just a fancy meteorological term used on the news. It is a physical force that dictates fish behavior. Crappie have a swim bladder, an internal organ filled with gas that helps them maintain neutral buoyancy. When a strong weather front approaches and the barometric pressure drops rapidly, the pressure surrounding the fish decreases. This causes their swim bladder to expand. If a crappie is sitting in 3 feet of water when this happens, that expanding bladder becomes extremely uncomfortable, almost painful. To counteract this expansion and relieve the internal pressure, the fish has no choice but to dive deeper. The increased water weight in deeper zones compresses the swim bladder back to a normal, comfortable size. So, when you see those dark clouds rolling in and the weatherman is talking about falling pressure, you can bet your bottom dollar that those fish are abandoning the shallow nesting sites and heading for the safety of the deep drop-offs just to physically feel better. Now, let us discuss the aftermath of that storm, the dreaded bluebird sky. The storm has passed, the wind is howling out of the north, and the sky is an incredibly bright, cloudless blue. Many weekend fishermen look at this beautiful weather and think it is the absolute perfect time to hit the lake. They expect the crappie to be sunning themselves in the shallows, but this is actually one of the toughest times to fish the banks. High pressure has settled in, pushing the fish down, and the intense, unfiltered sunlight penetrates straight through the clear spring water. Crappie do not have eyelids, and their large eyes are highly sensitive to bright light. In shallow water without any cloud cover or surface chop to break up the rays, the light is simply too blinding. To escape this intense glare, they retreat from the shallow flats and bury themselves deep inside thick brush piles or under heavy rock ledges in 10 to 20 feet of water. They will lock their jaws and refuse to move until the shadows lengthen in the late afternoon. So, if they are not in the shallows, where exactly do they go? This is the million-dollar question that separates the frustrated beginners from the seasoned veterans. When the conditions push them back, crappie do not just aimlessly swim around the middle of the lake. They are very predictable in their retreat. They will almost always pull back to the very first significant depth change adjacent to their spawning flat. We call this the first drop-off or the staging break line. If the shallow flat is 2 to 4 feet deep, look for the spot where the bottom suddenly falls away to 10 or 12 feet. This ledge acts like a safety bunker. The fish can sit in the deeper, more stable water, hovering just above a submerged stump or a pile of rocks, while still keeping an eye on the shallow dining room above. They want to be as close to the spawning grounds as possible, without actually being vulnerable to the weather changes. If you can locate this specific transition line on your map, you will find the entire school waiting out the storm. To truly master this concept, you have to start looking at the lake bottom like a roadmap. Underwater creek channels are the superhighways for migrating spring crappie. They never just wander across a barren mud flat to get to the shallows. They follow the winding ditches and depressions left behind by old creeks before the lake was flooded. When a cold front hits or the water drops, these creek channels provide the perfect immediate escape route. The fish simply slide off the shallow edge and drop down into the ditch. If you are beating the banks and not getting a single bite, you need to turn your boat around, turn your back to the shore, and cast outward toward the mouth of the bay. You need to drag your baits along the edges of that invisible underwater creek. Imagine a line of fish hovering right on the lip of that drop, just out of sight. By following the creek channel out toward deeper water, you can intercept the fish as they retreat, turning a totally frustrating day into a highly productive one. Another massive factor that pushes spring crappie out of the shallows is heavy spring rain. We often think that rain brings life to the lake, and while it does eventually, a sudden spring downpour can destroy a shallow water bite. When a massive storm dumps 3 inches of rain overnight, the runoff pours into the back of the creeks. This runoff is usually significantly colder than the water already in the lake. It acts like a cold shower pouring directly onto the shallow spawning flats. This rapid influx of cold water immediately shocks the system of any crappie sitting in the shallows. They cannot tolerate that sudden temperature shock, so they instantly turn tail and swim back out to the main lake points or deep water bluffs, where the vast volume of water remains relatively undisturbed. You might pull up to your favorite shallow spot the morning after a storm, expecting a feeding frenzy, only to find the water cold, lifeless, and completely devoid of any active fish. The heavy rain washed them right out of the entire area. Along with the cold temperature, heavy spring rains bring another major problem to the shallows, and that is thick, heavy mud. Crappie are primarily sight feeders. They rely heavily on their large eyes to locate small minnows and insects in the water column. When the spring runoff washes tons of silt and clay into the shallow bays, the water turns the color of chocolate milk. The visibility drops to absolute zero. In this kind of environment, a crappie simply cannot hunt effectively. Their gills also get clogged with the heavy silt, making it physically difficult to breathe. Because the shallowest water gets muddied up first, the fish are forced to abandon their nests and move out toward the main lake, seeking clearer water where they can actually see their prey and breathe comfortably. If you insist on fishing the shallow, muddy water just because the calendar says it is springtime, you are fighting a losing battle against the basic biology and survival instincts of the fish. Let us dive a little deeper into the concept of shadows and sunlight penetration, because it is a massive piece of the puzzle. Even on a relatively stable day without a major cold front, The position of the sun dictates exactly where the crappie will position themselves. In the early morning, when the sun is low and long shadows are cast across the water, the fish feel secure moving up into the skinny water to feed. The low light gives them an ambush advantage over bait fish. But as the clock ticks toward noon and the sun rises high in the sky, those protective shadows completely disappear. The shallow water becomes illuminated like a stage under a bright spotlight. Crappie absolutely hate feeling exposed. Without the cover of shadows, they feel vulnerable to predators from above. As the sun gets higher and brighter, you will literally watch the bite die in the shallows. The fish slowly back out, dropping down into 12 or 15 feet of water where the light fades, and the dark depths provide a much-needed sense of security. Now we have to address the giant elephant in the room, which is fishing pressure. Spring is the most popular time of the year to chase crappie. Every weekend, Warrior with a boat and a bucket of minnows is hitting the local lake. The shallow coves become incredibly crowded. Imagine being a fish sitting in 3 feet of water, trying to go about your business. Suddenly, 10 aluminum boats plow into the bay. The wake crashes against the shoreline. Trolling motors are whining, heavy anchors are splashing, and people are stomping around on the aluminum decks. This unnatural noise and vibration sends massive shock waves through the shallow water. Crappie are not stupid. When their quiet nursery turns into a loud, chaotic traffic jam, their survival instincts kick into high gear. They will abandon the premium shallow cover and slide out to deeper, quieter water just to escape the relentless noise. If you pull up to a community hole that is packed with boats, you can almost guarantee the biggest, smartest fish have already left the shallows. Think about the specific sound of a trolling motor for a second. We think of them as being quiet, stealthy tools, but underwater, the hum of an electric motor grinding away is incredibly loud and highly unnatural. In a shallow, confined space, that sound bounces off the hard bottom and echoes loudly. When you have 5 or 6 boats constantly sweeping back and forth over a shallow flat, adjusting their spot lock and buzzing their motors, it creates a constant wall of noise. The older, larger crappie, the massive slabs that we are all trying to catch, did not grow that big by being careless. They are highly sensitive to these unnatural vibrations. While a few small, aggressive males might stay behind and tolerate the noise, the big females will quickly slide off the bank and drop down into a 20-foot channel where the noise dissipates. You might still catch a few tiny fish in the shallows, but the constant noise of the trolling motors has pushed your true trophy fish safely out of your reach into the deep sanctuary. Another critical mistake many anglers make is forgetting that crappie are predators, and their movements are largely dictated by their main food source. We get so incredibly focused on the spawning urge that we forget these fish still need to eat to survive. The primary food source for spring crappie is usually small shad or other schooling bait fish. These bait fish are also highly susceptible to weather changes. When a cold front drops the shallow water temperature, the microscopic plankton that the bait fish eat will die off or sink much deeper. The bait fish follow the plankton, moving out of the shallow coves and suspending over deeper water. And where the bait goes, the crappie will always follow. If you are stubbornly fishing a shallow brush pile, but the massive balls of baitfish have migrated out to the main lake points, you are fishing in a barren wasteland. You have to use your eyes and your electronics to track the food. If the shallows are devoid of bait, you can be certain that the crappie have packed their bags and moved back to the deep water to eat. Wind is an incredibly powerful factor that can either make or break your shallow water fishing, and it frequently pushes fish deep. A warm, gentle breeze blowing into a shallow cove can be a great thing, pushing warm surface water and active bait into the area. But a strong, sustained wind is a totally different story. When heavy winds pound a shallow shoreline for hours, it creates aggressive wave action. This churning water tears up the bottom, destroys fragile spawning beds, and creates a chaotic, turbulent environment. The water becomes choked with floating debris and thick mud. A crappie simply cannot maintain its position in that kind of heavy surge without expending a massive amount of physical energy. To avoid pure exhaustion and the complete destruction of their nests, the fish will evacuate the wind-blown shallows. They will retreat to the deep, calm water on the backside of a point or drop down to the bottom of a creek channel where the violent wave action above cannot affect them. The heavy wind literally pushes them out. To truly adapt to these constant changes, you have to completely rethink how you use your boat electronics. Too many guys just use their expensive fish finders to look at the depth while they blindly cast to the shoreline. When the shallow bite entirely dies, your sonar becomes your absolute most valuable weapon for finding the retreating fish. You need to stop looking at the top 3 feet of the water column and start heavily scanning the 10 to 20-foot depth ranges. Look for the subtle bottom transitions. Scan the sharp drop-offs just outside the spawning bays. Look for isolated deep brush piles that offer sanctuary from the nasty cold fronts. You will often see thick clusters of fish suspended perfectly halfway down the water column, hovering over a deep channel, totally inactive but stacked tightly together. They are simply waiting for the weather to stabilize. If you rely solely on your eyes and your old grandpa habits, you will miss these massive schools entirely. Trust your electronics to show you the deep water staging areas where the fish are actually hiding. Let us talk about how to actually fish these mid-depth staging areas once you realize the fish have retreated from the shallows. When crappie pull back to 10 or 15 feet of water due to a cold front or heavy pressure, their overall mood completely changes. They transition from being aggressive, shallow water hunters to lethargic, inactive sulkers. You cannot just cast a lively minnow out there and expect them to aggressively chase it down. Their strike zone shrinks to the exact size of a teacup. To catch these deep, retreating fish, you have to put the bait exactly on their nose and keep it there forever. This is where vertical jigging over deep structure becomes absolutely essential. You need to drop a heavy, compact jig straight down into the submerged timber or rock pile and hold it incredibly still. Do not impart wild, aggressive action. Just let it quiver slightly in the water. You have to annoy them into biting or present an incredibly easy meal that requires zero effort to eat. Unbreakable patience is the only way to beat a deep, inactive fish. You also need to critically reconsider the size and profile of your baits when you are targeting these fish that have been pushed back to the deep. In the warm shallows, a big, flashy, aggressive bait might easily trigger a violent reaction strike from a territorial fish. But when that cold front hits and they drop down to 15 feet, their metabolism slows down dramatically. A large, bulky bait will often spook them or be completely ignored. This is the perfect time to downsize everything. Switch to a tiny 1/32 ounce jig head. Use highly subtle, natural-colored plastics rather than bright, obnoxious colors. Switch to a much lighter fluorocarbon line to make your presentation look as natural and non-threatening as humanly possible. Imagine the fish are suffering from a terrible hangover. They do not want loud noises, they do not want bright lights, and they certainly do not want a huge, intimidating meal shoved in their face. By downsizing your presentation and slowing down your movements, you can coax those deep water fish into taking a gentle bite when absolutely nothing else works. Ultimately, becoming a truly successful spring crappie angler requires a massive shift in your overall mindset. You have to willingly throw away the rigid calendar-based rules that tell you the fish must always be in the shallow water during April and May. You have to stop being stubborn on the water. The absolute best fishermen are the ones who let the fish and the daily conditions dictate their strategy. If you pull up to the bank and do not get a solid bite in the first 30 minutes, do not just keep beating your head against the wall. except the simple fact that a weather change, dropping pressure, boat traffic, or bright sunlight has pushed them back out. Turn your boat around. Intensely look at your map. Find the nearest deep drop-off and start hunting the retreat routes. Flexibility is your absolute greatest tool on the water. When you finally understand that the spring migration is a constant flowing movement back and forth between the deep and the shallows, you will finally unlock the secret to catching massive stringers of crappie while everyone else is complaining about a bad day on the bank. Let us wrap this up and bring it all together. The biggest takeaway here is realizing that the spring crappie migration is never a permanent move. The weather, the barometric pressure, and the heavy crowds act as an invisible wall, constantly pushing those big slabs out of the shallows and right back down into the deep staging areas. The real turning point in your fishing career will happen the exact moment you stop stubbornly casting at empty shallow banks and start targeting the deep drop-offs and creek channels where those fish retreat. It changes everything. Instead of relying on blind luck and old myths, you are adapting to the real-time biology of the fish. Thank you so much for tuning in and watching today. If this video helped you entirely rethink your spring strategy, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share it with your fishing buddies. Now, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know, what is the most frustrating weather change you have ever dealt with while chasing spring crappie, and how did you adjust to save the day? Let us talk about it in the comments.